Hey, welcome to the shop. Today we're talking about TIG torch setup, and I think this gets overcomplicated so often. I know I went out and I bought every which accessory that I could buy to optimize for every situation, and as I learned and improved my skill, I realized that one setup can cover a wide variety of jobs in steel, aluminum, even some stainless steel, and so we're gonna try out this setup on each of those materials. But before we do that, let me just walk you through the setup and why I picked each of these pieces after trying so many different setups. So the first thing we'll look at is the torch itself. Now I have two different torches laid out here. Notice this one has a large head on it and this one is small. And you can tell what series torch you have because usually it's printed right here on the side, or just by looking at it, does it take the large or small consumables. I use a 3/32 of an inch tungsten for most things, and it's good clear down below 20 amps and even up a bit past 200 amps. And I use either 2% lanthanated tungsten or a multi-mix like the green one from CK Worldwide, and there are different multi-blend tungstens. I can't tell a huge difference between them, to be honest. I think the multi-mix lasts a little bit longer. Now just real quick on the back caps, notice I'm using these shorter back caps right here, and they have different threads for the big and small setups, but the shorter ones just save a little room, so because of that, I typically end up cutting my tungsten in half when I get it and then sharpening both ends. And sharpening both ends doesn't just give you the opportunity to use both of them, it actually makes it easier to slide in and out of your collet. So it's nice from that perspective. Now up on the front end of the torch, you have a heat shield or insulator. And this is pretty straightforward, but they come in some different types, and notice how this now notice how these actually have a little ridge around them. These are made to be able to take the gas lens. You could actually use a gas lens or a regular cup on the small ones, but on the big one, it's really just made for a gas lens. Now, one of the nuances to these right here that a lot of people aren't aware of is if you have a CK Worldwide brand torch, like let me show you right here next to the heavy hitters. So the CK actually has a metal ring on it rather than the silicone rubber, and so the same heat shield insulator won't fit on CK torches, so you need to have a special one for that that's just slightly different. So if you buy just like an Amazon pack of consumables, it might not fit very well on CK torches, though I found you can sand them down to make them fit because they're usually too tight. Now the next thing is your collet, and this is what actually locks it in place. Now these collets here are a type called a wedge collet, and the wedge collet, rather than having a split in it that clamps down, it actually just shoves your electrode to the side and holds it there. And the reason I like those is when you start running a little bit higher amperage, the split collets like this one right here has a split in it, and if you notice, it's kind of mangled up, and so because of that, they don't always last forever. So the wedge collets work a little bit better long term. That being said, it does jam up a little bit when you're trying to move your tungsten electrode in and out, so it can make it a little more difficult, but I think it's an overall win to use the wedge collets. Now I'm just using a regular gas lens here, and notice this is really short on the smaller torch, like the number 20 here. But if you go with the larger torches, they generally have longer consumables. So this is a stubby gas lens. And what the stubby gas lens will do is it allows you to adapt the same cup that you'd use on the smaller torch. And so by doing that, you actually shorten your torch up by like an inch, and it makes it work really quite well. Now the cup I'm using is a number 7 cup. Now this is a little bit bigger than I would use for a regular aluminum setup and a little bit smaller than I'd use for like steel and stainless steel, but it certainly is good enough for all around use. So let's go ahead and put this together, set up the machine, and try it out on some steel, aluminum, and stainless steel. I'm using the HTP Invertig 301 for all of the welding today. This is a new addition to the shop, and it's going to let us do some really cool things on some upcoming videos about some more advanced TIG welding topics. So we're going to be welding together here on steel a lap joint, and a lap joint can be a lot better than a T-joint if you're practicing your fillet welds, and I'll show you why in a minute. But I have the machine just set on DC, and I'm going to crank it up to about 145 amps, which is just a little bit more than you'll need for this joint, but I like to have a little headroom whenever I'm using a foot pedal. So the only other setting I'm going to double check is my post flow and make sure I have some there. I'll crank it up to 10 seconds, which may be overkill, but I'd rather use a little bit extra gas and keep my weld nice. Now in order to tack this together, I just go here on the side and place an autogenous tack right in the middle. Just no filler metal at all, heat it up until it merges together. And I'll show you up close after I tack both sides what that looks like. But it's a pretty straightforward technique, and notice after I put the tack on, I just hold the torch there so that gas can flow, because I don't want it to oxidize. Even though it's out of the weld zone, it's just a good practice to have. Now let's go ahead and weld this together. Here's the game plan. I'm going to point right down at that joint and then pull back onto the bottom just a little bit and trace along that edge while dabbing some filler metal. Let's go. So I've started my arc there on the bottom, and once the puddle's established, I will feed some filler metal in there and then follow along. Notice how my filler metal is going in at about a 90-degree angle to my tungsten. That is a good practice. So here's what it looks like under the hood when I get started and I start that puddle and then dab some filler metal in there. And in this case, I'm trying to just roll it barely over the top. So I'm feeding enough filler and letting that puddle grow until it goes over the top. And as I move down and get closer to the end of the joint, I can motor along fairly quickly right here, and it's working out okay. So I keep dabbing along, and in the end it came out with something that looks pretty good for a weld on steel. You're going to typically have some gray oxidation like this no matter what you do, and if you used a huge cup, you could avoid some of that. And honestly, if I used a little bit more amperage and welded faster, it would probably reduce it a little bit, but it's certainly acceptable. It'll hold. Now, the reason I like a lap joint for practice is notice the oxidation on the back side. If this were a T-joint, that'd be right in your other joint. But on a lap joint, I can flip it over and it's just ready to go. Now let's try some stainless steel. I'm going to use pulse on this, and so I'll set my pulser at 120 hertz or 120 pulses per second. And for the peak time and background amperage, I usually just go with 50-50. It works just fine for me. Now I'm going to turn it down to 100 amps, which is probably a little higher than I'd normally use for some 16 gauge stainless, which is what I'm going to be welding on here. But since I have the pulser on, it loses a little bit of power from those lower parts of the cycle. So I'm tacking this together in an outside corner joint, and I'm going to weld it autogenously with no filler. This is a pretty common joint to weld right here in some cases. So I'll put one more tack on it. And I like to have my tack for these just a little bit inboard of the end, on the end that I start with, because then it won't pop apart when I get started. But you can see the tacks came out nice and clean. You might brush that if you're doing something sanitary, but for this, it's clean enough, and that's really not necessary. So the procedure for this is simple enough. Just start the arc, and I'm paying attention to my arc length, my angle, and my travel speed, just to push the pedal along and not run away from it. And it's as straightforward as that. So you can see here where I'm tracing along my puddle, I can control that penetration a little bit with my amperage and travel speed, and how much penetration you need really depends on the application of what you're doing. Sometimes you just need it to seal, and sometimes you want to penetrate down in deep. But either way, you can see from a shielding perspective, as I pass that cup, I do get a little bit of oxidation on the surface there, but the color is acceptable for most things and it'll hold. You can see there at the end, there is a little bit of bluing. I probably could have stood to have a little bit more post flow, or maybe didn't hold my torch there as well as I should have, but either way, perfectly acceptable. So if you are just getting started, I'm going to tell you the most important thing to learning to TIG weld is having proper technique. And the best way to learn that is by learning one aspect of it at a time and practicing it. And so I've put together some online courses you can find linked in the description, where I'll walk through each of the aspects that you need to know one at a time, so you don't get overwhelmed and you get a little bit of practice on each of them so it becomes second nature, and then you move on to the next. Be sure to check those out. Now let's try the same setup out on aluminum. Here I'm gonna turn off my pulse and turn on AC. So I'm gonna set it to 120 hertz and 75% balance. And I'm not using any of the fancy features like waveforms or asymmetric waveforms or anything like that. It's just straight up regular AC on an inverter. Now I'm going to flip my tungsten around. It's always a good practice when you're switching between materials to change out to a fresh one. So here we go. Even though it was still pretty sharp, you can end up with a little bit of the other material deposited on, and I don't want to cross-contaminate. Now I'll go ahead and start off here. You can see once again I'm just dabbing in about 90 degrees from my torch, and I'm waiting for a puddle to form before I start feeding some filler metal in. And this is kind of smaller diameter filler than I'd normally use, but it's what I had around, so I'm having to push it in with my thumb a bit. Notice when I start the arc here, it's etching the oxide layer off, and it's a pretty wide etching band, and that's really the result that you get from using this cup that's a number 7 compared with a smaller like a number 5. And that is not a problem necessarily unless the aesthetics are a problem from it. So it still works just fine. I get a nice clean bead all the way along and welds really nicely. In fact, I like to use a 7 or an 8 on aluminum sometimes, depending on the joint, instead of a small cup ideally. So it works for all 3 materials. Let's take a look at the finished bead here up close, and you can see it came out plenty clean enough, perfectly acceptable there. And you can also see that the etching band is a little bit wide from where the argon covered. So this one setup right here, it's pretty simple and straightforward, and we can use it for just about any job on the steel, aluminum, a lot of jobs on stainless, though not all. And you're not going to do any like titanium work with this, but it is a good all-around setup if you just want to leave it set up all the time. Hey, thanks a ton for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this or learned something, let me know by hitting that thumbs up below or leaving me a comment, and we'll see you next time.